I can give him a better life. Tieu Van's voice was calm, too calm, the kind of calm that doesn't come from peace, but from someone who has already cried enough. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They landed directly in Trieu Duong's chest. Heavy, unavoidable. I can give him a real home, education, everything he deserves. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to argue, because both of them knew she was right. Trieu Duong didn't answer. He couldn't. In his arms, Truc Lam slept quietly. His small body curled against him, his breathing soft and steady, completely unaware that his future, his entire life, was being weighed in silence. Trieu Duong lowered his gaze, looked at the child, then slowly at Tieu Van. A big house, money, security, a future without struggle. Everything he didn't have, everything he couldn't promise. If you were me right now, his voice was barely above a whisper, would you hold on or let go? No one answered, because there was no right answer. Tieu Van stood still, her fingers clenched tightly at her sides. I'm not saying this to take him away from you, she continued, her voice softer now. I'm saying this because I know what it feels like to grow up without anything. Her eyes trembled. I don't want him to go through that. Trieu Duong's jaw tightened. And you think I do? He asked quietly. Tieu Van flinched. I raised him, he continued, his voice low but steady. From nothing, from the day I found him, until now. He paused. His grip on the baby tightened slightly. I know what he needs, and I know what you can't give him, she said. Silence. That sentence cut deeper than anything before. Trieu Duong didn't react immediately, but something inside him shifted. Not anger, not hatred, something quieter, something heavier. Truth. Because again, she wasn't wrong. He looked around. The small house, the worn wooden table, the thin blanket, everything simple, everything barely enough. Then he looked at the baby again. If love isn't enough, he whispered, more to himself than to her, then what am I supposed to do? Tieu Van didn't answer, because she didn't have one. The room fell silent, and for the first time, the distance between them wasn't anger. It was understanding, a painful kind of understanding. That night, nothing was decided, but everything had changed. Days passed. Tieu Van didn't bring up the conversation again. She didn't ask to take the baby, didn't argue, didn't push. She stayed, but she stayed differently. She no longer tried to get close, no more reaching out, no more asking to hold him. Instead, she watched, from a distance, like someone standing outside a life that should have been hers. Every morning, she would wake up early, before Trieu Duong. She would stand near the doorway, quiet, still, watching Truc Lam sleep, the rise and fall of his chest, the small movements of his fingers, the soft sounds he made in his dreams. Sometimes her hand would lift slightly, as if she wanted to touch him, but it never reached. It always stopped midway, then slowly fell back down. Trieu Duong noticed. Of course he did. He noticed everything. The way she kept her distance. The way she spoke softly, but never too close. The way her eyes followed every little movement of the baby, but her body never crossed the invisible line. First, he thought it was guilt. Then he realized it was fear. Fear of being rejected again. Fear of hurting him. Or worse, hurting herself. She hasn't touched him in 3 days. Trieu Duong murmured quietly one afternoon, watching her from the corner of his eye. Truc Lam sat on the mat, playing with a small wooden toy, laughing, happy. Tieu Van sat across the room, not too far, not too close, just enough to see him. Why are you doing that? Trieu Duong asked suddenly. She looked up, confused. Doing what? This, he gestured slightly, staying away.
Tieu van hesitated.
Then looked back at the baby. I don't want to scare him again, she said softly. Her voice didn't shake this time, but it carried something deeper. If he cries because of me again, she paused, swallowing hard. I don't think I can handle it. Trieu Duong didn't respond immediately. He looked at her, really looked, and for the first time he saw it clearly. This wasn't punishment. This wasn't guilt. This was someone standing at the edge of something precious, too afraid to step forward. There are people, he said slowly, his voice thoughtful, who suffer not because they lost something, Tieu Van looked up again, but because they don't dare to take it back. The words hung in the air. Tieu Van's eyes filled, but she didn't cry. Not this time. She just nodded, because she understood, better than anyone. That evening, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the yard. Trieu Duong sat outside with Truc Lam in his arms. The baby leaned against him, half asleep. Tieu Van stood near the doorway, watching, as always. If one day, Trieu Duong spoke quietly, not turning around, he reaches for you? She froze. Will you still step back? Silence. Then, very softly, no. Her answer was quiet, but certain, and for the first time something shifted again. Not between them, but within them, because deep down they both knew. This story was not about choosing who loved the child more. It was about learning how to love, without destroying each other in the process. The change didn't happen all at once. Came slowly, quietly, almost unnoticed. First, it was just a glance. A brief moment where Truc Lam's eyes lingered on Tieu Van a little longer than before. Not fear, not rejection, just curiosity. Tieu Van didn't move. She didn't dare. She only sat there, her hands resting tightly on her lap, as if even the smallest motion might break something fragile. Hey, she whispered softly one morning. Her voice barely carried through the air. Truc Lam turned. Not fully, not immediately, but enough. And that was the first time he didn't look away. Something inside her trembled. Not hope, not yet, but something close to it. Trieu Duong saw everything. From the way the baby's eyes followed her voice, to the way her breath stopped every time he moved even slightly closer. He said nothing, but his grip on the child tightened just a little. If you were me, he murmured under his breath later that day, standing alone outside. Would you be happy or afraid? The wind didn't answer, because the truth was he already knew. It was both. Days passed. Tieu Van stayed the same, careful, distant, gentle. She never rushed forward, never reached out first, but she was always there, watching, waiting, and slowly that presence began to matter. One afternoon, while Trieu Duong was fixing a broken fence, Truc Lam sat on the mat nearby, playing with a small wooden toy. Tieu Van sat across from him as she always did. Not too close, not too far. She picked up a small piece of cloth, twisted it slightly, then let it fall. A soft movement.
Truc Lam noted.
His hands paused, his head tilted slightly. She froze. Then very slowly, she did it again. The cloth moved, light, gentle. Truc Lam made a small sound, a quiet, curious noise, and for the first time he leaned forward, not toward Trieu Duong, toward her. The moment hit like a shock. Trieu Duong's hand stopped mid-air. The tool in his grip tightened. His chest felt heavy, because this was the moment he had been afraid of. Not loud, not dramatic, but real. He's just curious, he told himself silently, but his heart didn't believe it. Tieu Van didn't move. Her entire body was still. She didn't want to scare him. didn't want to break this fragile connection. "Hey," she whispered again, softer this time.
Chúc làm blinket.
Then lifted his hand. A small reach, unsteady, incomplete, but enough. Enough to make everything shift. Trieu Duong looked away, because he couldn't watch. Not like this. He walked further into the yard, pretending to focus on work. But every sound, every small movement, still reached him. If he reaches for her, he thought, his jaw tightening. What am I supposed to do? The question stayed with him. That night he couldn't sleep. Truck lamb lay beside him, peaceful, warm, the same as always. But everything felt different. He looked at the child, then closed his eyes. "I knew this day would come," he whispered, and that was the truth. From the very beginning he knew that no matter how much love he gave, no matter how much time passed, there was something he could never replace. A bond that didn't need to be built, because it was already there. He sat up slowly. Across the room, Tieu Van was awake. She didn't say anything, but their eyes met, and in that silence they both understood. "You don't have to stay away," Trieu Duong said quietly.
Tieu van France.
"I mean it," he continued. "You don't have to keep your distance like that." Her lips trembled. "I'm not staying away for you," she said softly. "Then for who?" "For him." The answer came immediately, without hesitation. "If I go too fast," she continued, her voice shaking slightly, "and he cries again, I won't be able to handle it." Silence. Trieu Duong looked down. He understood, more than he wanted to. "Do you think," he asked slowly, "that he'll choose you?" Tieu Van didn't answer right away. She looked at the baby, then back at him. "I don't know," she said honestly. "And that scares you?" She nodded. "But not as much as losing him again." The words landed softly, but deeply. Trieu Duong exhaled slowly, because he realized they weren't on opposite sides. They were both afraid of the same thing, losing him, just in different ways. The next day it happened again.
Chúc làm crowet.
This time more stable, more certain. He moved forward, stopped, then looked up. Tieu Van. She didn't move, didn't breathe. Then slowly he leaned toward her. Closer, closer. Trieu Duong watched from behind, his heart pounding. If this keeps happening, he thought, one day he won't look back at me anymore. And that thought scared him more than anything, because love was no longer about holding on. It was about preparing to let go. The moment didn't come with a warning. No loud cry, no dramatic change, just a quiet afternoon, the kind that feels ordinary until it becomes unforgettable. The sunlight stretched across the yard, soft and warm. The wind moved gently, brushing through the leaves, carrying a calm that didn't match the tension still lingering between them. Truck Lamb sat on the mat, his small hands pressed against the ground, his body slightly wobbling as he tried to steady himself. He was stronger now, more aware. Trieu Duong stood a few steps away. Tieu Van sat across from him. The same distance as always, but something had changed, because this time the child moved with intention. He leaned forward, paused, then pushed himself ahead. One small crawl, then another. Both of them froze, because he wasn't crawling randomly. He was moving toward the space between them. Trieu Duong straightened slowly. Tieu Van held her breath. Truck Lamb stopped. He looked up. His eyes moved from Trieu Duong to Tieu Van, back and forth, as if deciding, as if searching. Trieu Duong's chest tightened. This is it. The thought came quietly, but it hit harder than anything before. This is the moment. Tieu Van's fingers curled slightly against her knees, her whole body tense, afraid to hope, afraid to lose. If you were here right now, Trieu Duong's voice was low, almost lost in the air. Would you want him to choose you, or choose what's right for him? He didn't know the answer, because this wasn't about winning. It was about losing in a way that no one prepares you for. Truck Lam lifted his hand, small, unsteady, and reached forward. For a second, it looked like he would go to Tieu Van. Her breath stopped. Her eyes filled instantly. Then his body shifted. He turned slightly toward Trieu Duong. And in that tiny, fragile moment, everything inside both of them broke. Because either way, someone would lose. But then something unexpected happened. Truck Lam didn't crawl further. He stopped, right in the middle. His small body swayed slightly, then steadied, and slowly, very slowly, he lifted both hands. One hand reached toward Tieu Van, the other toward Trieu Duong. Time stopped. Neither of them moved, because neither of them had imagined this. A choice that wasn't a choice. A reach that didn't leave anyone behind.
Tieu Van's lips trembled.
Tears fell without sound. Trieu Duong exhaled slowly, a breath he didn't know he had been holding. And then they moved, at the same time, two hands, reaching back, touching his, warm, gentle, real.
Trúc Lam smile.
A small, innocent smile, but enough to shatter everything they had feared. Tieu Van let out a quiet sob, not from pain, but from relief. Trieu Duong lowered his gaze, because for the first time he wasn't afraid. The baby leaned forward, lost balance, and fell. A small fall, nothing serious, but this time neither of them rushed. They stayed, watching, together. Truck Lam pushed himself up again, faster, stronger, then laughed. A clear, bright sound that filled the entire space. Tieu Van laughed through her tears. Trieu Duong shook his head slightly, a faint smile appearing. "He's okay," she whispered. "He's strong," he replied. Their voices didn't collide anymore. They met, for the first time, on the same side. The wind moved softly around them. The sunlight shifted. The moment passed, but something remained. "I thought loving him meant holding on tighter than anyone else," Trieu Duong said quietly. Tieu Van looked at him. "But maybe," he continued, "it means trusting that he can love more than one person without leaving anyone behind. Silence, but not heavy, peaceful. I don't want to take him away from you," Tieu Van said softly. "And I don't want to lose him to you," he replied. They looked at each other, then both looked at the child. "Maybe," she whispered, "he was never meant to belong to just one of us." Trieu Duong nodded. "Maybe." Truck Lam crawled again, closer this time, between them, and without hesitation they moved closer too. Not to claim him, but to stay with him, together. If this story made you feel something, Trieu Duong's voice softened, like a quiet reflection, then maybe you understand. Sometimes, love isn't about choosing who stays. Tieu Van gently placed her hand near the child's. It's about choosing not to leave. The sun dipped lower. The sky turned gold. And in that small yard, a story that once began with abandonment didn't end with loss. It ended with something harder, something braver, a choice to stay.